This is a 2024 Protro build of the Nike Air Oscillate and has one of the most advanced midsole setups I've ever had underfoot, and it's also the only one in existence. How do I know it's the only one? Because I'm the one that designed and built them. Let's get into it. And if you're not aware of why I would choose the Air Oscillate and just the storied history of the Oscillate, it is one of Nike's most famous shoes, as well as, to me, one of the best stories just in performance shoes. And it was made for Pete Sampras back in the late 90s without Pete Sampras even knowing about it. Tinker Hatfield, the legendary Nike sneaker designer, wanted to design a new shoe for Pete Sampras and just had a gut feeling about the underfoot performance and outward appearing classic lines of the Oscillate, and was so confident in it that he invited Pete over to his house and casually tricked him into playing some basketball with him, knowing full well he didn't bring basketball shoes over to play in, and knowing that Pete was notoriously averse to change, especially with shoes or rackets. So he casually gave him the Air Oscillate to play basketball in, and the thing that I love about that story is he was so confident that he knew what Sampras would like in a shoe. That's how good of a sneaker designer he was, that he designed this sight unseen for the guy, knowing he'd like them. And Sampras liked them so much, just not having the pressure of, this is your new shoe, this is a new marketing campaign for the shoe. He liked them so much, he asked him if there was a version he could play tennis in, and of course he had already made them. And of course, as you know, the rest is history. But that was 1997, so fast forward to now, where Nike Tennis is starting to introduce retro models and throwback colorways, like the Mac Attacks, or the Attacks as they're calling it, the Vapor Mac Attack, the Supreme Court Posits, the re-released Vapor 9.5s. But to be honest, at least in my opinion, none of those shoes they've re-released have had the punch that those Air Oscillates had.
So I mean, these shoes are pushing 30 years old. They're actually still not too bad. I mean, they've been used here and there, so the Phylon is getting used, and they're somewhat broken in, so they're not super stiff, but you can tell when these were new, they were a lot more plush, a lot more comfortable, but they also do have a ton of side-to-side stability with how fat the flange is. Not so much sharp or wide, but just flat and bold, basically.
And since sneaker technology has come quite a long way since 1997, although I guess in some ways it hasn't. But in any case, me being a lover of all things tennis shoes, just wanted to see if I could create a prototype for a 2024 Nike Air Oscillate Protro, keeping the original lines of the shoe, but under the hood updating it with Nike and the industry's most bleeding edge materials. Because especially in the basketball space, I've seen these performance retros, or Protros, combining newer materials with older silhouettes, have really great success both with amateur as well as pro players. So step one, we got to open this thing up and see what parts of this shoe to replace, but more importantly, which ones to keep. Number two, we'll dig into my parts bin and see what kind of new tooling or materials we can fit into these things. Number three, see if we can put this thing back together and actually create a working prototype or proof of concept. And step four, get them on court to hopefully test this Franken shoe out. The Air Oscillates I have obviously are pretty old, so the glue is really not hard to loosen with boiling water, but the one thing I'm already noticing is that the 4-foot drag guard is much more fragile than it outwardly seems, as it's the only part starting to bubble and rip versus the rest of it, which is coming off pretty easily. It's odd because it looks so substantial from the outside, but yeah, just doing an impromptu upper durability test on it, it is not the most resistant thing we've ever seen. So looking at the midsole now that the uppers are off really gives the age of these away. The 4-foot Zoom miraculously still has air tension, but the rear foot Air Max unit is an early generation of Nike Air with not only the chamber made of translucent polyurethane, which is what you see nowadays on most of these units outwardly, but that chamber is then encased in a caked on layer of urethane foam, which I honestly don't hate. It feels decently buttery, but it just takes up a lot of real estate. So this one's coming out too. Now the rest of the midsole and the large majority of that midsole is just EVA with a super broad bottom-loaded molded carbon fiber composite shank. God, that's a mouthful. All of which I'm happy with. I mean, more dense EVAs are really still, in my opinion, a fine option for the carrier foam of court shoes because, there's stability going side to side and the ability to dial in the weight and density so easily. But I'm sure as you can guess, it's the giant holes now in the shoe that we really want to focus on and augment to bring these up to today's specs. This unassuming bin here is my parts box. It's where I keep shoes that I think have materials I may want to use later for things like this, and in this case, I think Nike running may have some of the parts I need. The problem is that Nike running shoes have some pretty aggressive geometry to them, and I'm most interested in harvesting some ZoomX foam, but it has to be able to fit the geometry of the Oscillates. And ZoomX is just a PebX-based foam, which Way of Wade brand also makes, but in a more forgiving geometry. So I'm gonna use their PebX foam as a substitute for ZoomX. But if you're wondering, no, I have not forgotten about all the air I also took out of that shoe. One of the most common things I hear is people wishing Nike tennis and basketball would use ZoomX foam. And the reason these Peba foams aren't used as much is because they're so unstable when used solo for side-to-side sports. Polyether block amide foams are unreal for running shoes because they are being used going in one direction and don't need to withstand the shear forces that court sports put on a shoe. They also provide magnitudes of order better energy return than other foams when they're new, plus they're feather light. And some companies are starting to figure out how to incorporate them more and more into their court shoes, specifically in the basketball space, with Way of Wade really leading the way currently, with some of their shoes being full beds of this stuff while still retaining really good stability just based on the exoskeleton of the shoe, carrier foams, or just the makeup of their specific Peba foams being more stable than others, as we've seen with the Nike GT Cut 3, where Nike first tried to make a basketball shoe out of their Peba-based ZoomX foam. But unlike these others, although ZoomX does take the cake in terms of being the lightest Peba-based foam, it just doesn't have the side-to-side stability for court sports. So that being said, for this part of the midsole augmentation, I'm happy to utilize the stable EVA as a carrier and then pop two Peba foam units in the forefoot and rear foot, kind of act as my ZoomX components of the shoe, quote unquote. You can see already how much of a pop these things give the shoe, with the bounce height test showing 34 centimeters of bounce height in the rear foot and then 34 in the forefoot. And even though they are sitting in really old EVA, that Peba foam is very insulating and gives pretty consistent performance both in the rear foot and the forefoot, and that's not even including the Zoom Air we haven't put in these shoes yet. So piggybacking off of that, since the original Oscillates were meant for somebody with the pro skills of Pete Sampras, I still want to retain some of what made the Oscillates, and I still want to keep Nike's signature performance shoe tooling, Zoom Air, as part of these shoes, especially to see what PebX plus Zoom would feel like. So I do have these full-length Zoom Air units to go over top of it, but the only problem is the shoe isn't meant to handle that much bulk and stack under the strobo board, right? And it's tough even simulating the reattachment, especially because that red swoosh is really a cutout that the uppers have to fit under the midsole in like a puzzle piece. So I'm going to have to wait till a little later to see how and if I can utilize these. But after seeing what was in the midsole of the Oscillates and trying to create something modern from it, and honestly just second guessing myself on what to do with these Zoom Air units, it really brought up a lot of questions in my mind about how shoes used to be constructed and the performance of shoes, that 10, 15, 20 years ago versus shoes that we're seeing now. And, my perspective as a foot doctor is one thing, but there's also the other perspective of people that are using these shoes in the most extreme circumstances that they possibly could be used in, and that is a touring tennis professional. So I got in touch with my buddy Bjorn Fratangelo, who in addition to being an ATP professional is also the coach of Madison Keys, and I wanted to get his perspective on number one, what he looks for in shoes, how important he thinks the shoe component to the professional game is, and just what his thoughts are on the evolution of shoes from when he started until now. In the hierarchy of equipment from clothes, racket, strings, and shoes, where on that scale do shoes fit for you or for most people
I think it's right up there with rackets.
Really?
Yeah, I think you see a lot of people, if they have to change clothing companies, they struggle for a little bit. Or, I think some guys and girls are habitual. Like you see Grigor now, who's changed to Lacoste, refuses to get out of the Nike shoe and
Right.
kind of go to the Lacoste shoe. I could say, a lot of people wear older models, still to this day. And then you have people that I think just go with the flow of, if they've been with a brand for a long time and that brand keeps kind of coming out with new generations of shoes, like they'll just keep wearing the new shoe, which is kind of what I did with the Barricade. And then, there was a generation or two that I didn't love it and kind of switched over to the other model for a bit. I would argue that, players do care a lot about the shoes. I just think, it depends if you're looking at maybe the top guys who have a say or not, as opposed to, somebody that was kind of my level or even lower. You don't get to really pick that much.
And are there a lot of pros that are getting custom lasted shoes, like the shoes made around their foot shape? You always see some of them where they'll have them in the plaster or on a force scanner, but that doesn't seem like that's the norm for pros. That seems like that's more of a top 1% type thing, or does that go further down than we think?
No, yeah, I think you're right. I think the custom shoes are, kind of saved for, people who are really going to have an impact in the brand. And then I think it's a little bit brand dependent too. Like I do know, some of the American guys that used to wear Fila, had a little bit of subtle changes that were in the shoe versus the one you'd buy in the store, but pretty minor. So just little touches here and there that I think, suited them.
Now, is there anything in terms of older shoes that you miss more versus newer ones? Because I hear a lot of complaints that people wish there was still leather on their shoes, more natural components, that shoes fit better, they were built better back in the day. I kind of disagree because I'd rather have a lighter material, even if it is cheaper, quote unquote.
Right. I feel like nowadays everything is so on the ground, and I don't remember if I just wasn't aware about it as much, growing up, and then, or even my early career. Like, obviously I've had a lot of foot troubles over the last couple of years, so I've been a lot more aware of how I feel and, the impact that a shoe makes. But for the majority of my career, I didn't wear orthotics. I didn't really care too much. I was a one sock guy for the most part, didn't really wear two pairs, but like I never really felt on the ground like I do now. And I don't know, what's changed. Even like I said earlier in the video, from, looking at like the Barricade 6 or 7 as opposed to the one now. Like, I don't remember that same feeling where it's like I feel like I'm just touching the court surface, as opposed to then I felt like I was secure in a shoe.
So after talking to Bjorn, I am a little bit more re-energized to keep a nod to the original Oscillates alive in them. Still have some ideas of how I'm going to do that, but for now I'm going to let the glue dry in those foam units and start updating the uppers. Since the uppers on these are pretty old school with that classic leather look, I don't want to take too much away from that, so I got some thicker leather pieces to make some new foxing and reinforcing elements with. And to design the reinforcing elements, a few days ago, I actually printed out some Nike swooshes of varying sizes, and the smaller ones seemed like it fit the best while the uppers were off and just to the naked eye. So I just went with it and used my sewing awl to lock stitch them into place in a reverse swoosh configuration, not only for the aesthetics, trying to kind of bring these up to today's style, but also for the fattest part of that swoosh being sewn into the rear foot for more stability. Although as I'm looking at these swooshes now, the swooshes aren't looking too substantial, which I just may have to rectify a little bit later. But by far the easiest part of this build so far is popping a runner's knot lace eyelet into the back of the anterior ankle collar, just some additional lockdown. It's honestly such an easy, quick upgrade for really any shoe that doesn't already have one. And now that I've got the uppers and midsole augmented, it's really time to get that old glue off of the midsole and the uppers with the burr, which honestly is a testament to how strong the bulk of the uppers are of the Oscillates, and just how weak that drag guard is. So once the old glue is off, which is honestly hard to tell because the midsole it's just definitely starting to show its age in general, it's time for new glue, a quick setup period, and then heating and bonding. And in a case like this, with this older EVA, I was ready for it to be a bit unforgiving, but unfortunately the midsole was just stiff enough and did not want to let me match up the forefoot because that drag guard material was so flimsy and paper mache-like, and the EVA was so stiff, it was really difficult to get the tips to hold together because either the EVA was trying to push back or the drag guard was starting to rip when you put the glue on it, even though the underside of all that was bonding solid and really nicely. So the end product in the forefoot looks, I guess we'll just call it homemade. And I even thought to run a stitch through the forefoot, just to make it more solid, but driving the needle in from distal to proximal was actually making it worse. So I ended up throwing the stitches in from inside to out, which allowed better contact, but was also so difficult just to keep straight. So once again, Even though the build was solid, the look was, yeah, we'll just keep going with homemade looking. But now that the shoe is lined up and actually together, the swoosh just looks small, out of place, and just lacks purpose. So against my wish to be able to just finish this project, I'm gonna take the old swoosh off and I'm going with a size up, which, yeah, it just looks so much better. And now it looks like it actually serves some purpose, giving some lateral stability to that rear foot. And yeah, now there's some visible holes in the uppers, but I just keep telling myself it's a proof of concept shoe, and that seems to quiet down my inner anxiety about showing these to all of you. But before I test these out, there is still the matter of the missing Zoom Air. My original thought was to sew them in as the Strobel and make a true Zoom Strobel, but the sides are too narrow for me to sew into. And when I think back to the Zoom Strobel shoes I've tested in the past, most of them, to me, act as a comfort feature, not as much of a performance feature. So for this one, I decided just to glue them down from the top side of the Strobel, so at least I could get the feel for them and not just potentially ruin the uppers by taking off the original Strobel, and then at the same time potentially popping the Zoom Air unit. And with that relatively easy glue job done, all that's left is to get some insoles on top of them, and it's time to get them on court. I gotta say, while the original Oscillates were smooth and stable underfoot, having the Zoom and Pebex underfoot combined with the more stiff EVA is quite the fun experience. You still get the stability of the Oscillate, but it feels like the GP Turbo underfoot, super bouncy and lively, and just a really fun shoe to play in. And while the original Oscillates were just a dream shoe for somebody trying to pick up volleys, stay really stable, you did need to have a little bit of leg strength though to kind of get them going again, even though there was that Zoom Air unit in there. Most of it was just stiff EVA, whereas with these ones, you get that same stability, like I said, especially up at net, like a shoe for Sampras, but then it does pop up off the ground for serve after serve after serve. And of course, the Zoom Strobel in these, a little bit more for a comfort aspect, but as far as that goes, the feeling of that comfort and that buoyancy underfoot, plus that shock absorption, plus knowing you have that really violent bouncing foam under the heel and forefoot, is almost like a confidence boost under there, knowing you've got the stability of the Oscillates, but also the performance of something with Pebex Zoom, as well as that retained carbon fiber composite shank. And you know, good, bad, or indifferent, I'd love to know your thoughts on this 2024 Air Oscillate Protro prototype. That is an absolute mouthful. I'd love to know kind of, what shoes you'd like to see Nike Protro or bring back, especially in this case into the tennis space, and what shoes you'd like to see me try to rig up next on this channel. These videos to me are always the most fun to do because it is a challenge to conceptualize what you'd want to do with these shoes, what shoes you think would be, the best ones to mix and match different parts. So I love doing them, and if you'd love to see a certain shoe, I'm always looking for ideas. So thanks so much for hanging out with me in this video. Respect your rubber and foam. I'll see you somewhere in the Sneakerverse.